Israel's foreign minister touches down in Rabat. Yair Lapid meets senior officials in Morocco for the first time since the countries normalised ties. How significant is this visit? And will this newfound friendship help or hinder peace in the Middle East? I'm Melinda Newsofora, and today's newsmaker is Morocco's relationship with Israel. Not too long ago, you would have scoffed at the thought of a string of Arab nations normalising ties with Israel. But last year, Morocco became the latest to follow in the footsteps of the UAE, Bahrain and Sudan to formalise relations with its former foe, albeit with a little bit of help from the United States. But the kingdom has its own unique history with Israel. Morocco is home to the largest Jewish community in the Arab world, and they've lived there for centuries. 250,000 Moroccan Jews moved to Israel after its formation in 1948, and today, hundreds of thousands of Israelis claim Moroccan ancestry. Still, its decision to normalise ties sent a bit of a shock through the Arab region. Here's where the world stands today on the recognition of Israel.
Around 30 countries have no relations with the State of Israel. The majority of those are in the Arab world. In 1979, Egypt became the first Arab nation to sign a treaty with Israel. That was followed by Jordan in 1994. Then, in mid-2020, a slew of countries followed suit. The UAE in August, Bahrain in September, Sudan in October, and Morocco in December. Morocco actually first established formal relations with Israel in 1994. That was made possible by the signing of the Oslo Accords and a decade of closed-door diplomacy. 6 years later, Rabat cut ties during the Second Intifada, when Israel violently suppressed a Palestinian uprising. Then, in 2020, relations were restored in the wake of the Abraham Accords, brokered by the US under the Trump administration.
Yair Lapid's visit to Morocco is the first by an Israeli minister since 2003. It's also the first high-level meeting since ties were upgraded. But who's benefiting from this relationship and how? When the US announced Rabat was resuming diplomatic relations with Israel, then President Donald Trump called it a massive breakthrough for peace in the Middle East. But many Palestinians say they feel betrayed. So, what's Morocco getting out of this? To discuss that, I'm joined now from Tel Aviv by Israeli activist Bar-Yoshafat. In Doha, we have Yasmina Abouzzohour, who's a senior fellow at the Moroccan Institute for Policy Analysis, and Nadim Houry joins us from Paris. He's the executive director of the Arab Reform Institute. Thank you all so much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Yasmina, I'm going to start with you. What's in it for Morocco?
Morocco benefits from two sides, both from the US and from Israel. From the US, it got notably the recognition of its sovereignty over Western Sahara, as well as $3 billion pledged in aid to its private sector, and a potential $1 billion arms deal that's right now blocked by Congress but pending review. From Israel, it stands to gain a lot in terms of increased tourism. It has already established direct flights between Marrakesh and Tel Aviv. It also stands to benefit from economic cooperation in key sectors like agriculture, technology, so on and so forth. And there will likely be an increase in trade between the two.
With that in mind, Nadim, how do these normalisation deals, the one that Morocco we're seeing the formalisation of today, and the others, how is this being viewed by the everyday Arab person on the streets in other Arab regions?
Sure. So, thank you for having me. It's hard to talk about, the average Arab today and their views, because we're seeing a clear disconnect between countries and in some cases even between citizens. These normalization deals, I think the first point to make very clearly, they're not necessarily part of a broader peace dynamic. They're exactly to the image of the person who sort of created them, Trump. They're transactional. There's something in it for Morocco. There's something in it for Israel, but there isn't necessarily something in it for the peace process, for the Palestinians, or for the region more broadly. Most people, opinion polls in the region run by the Arab Barometer and others still show that the vast majority of citizens in the region oppose these deals. Now, it's very hard to know what some of the citizens of the other countries, like in the United Arab Emirates or in Bahrain, really believe, because of the climate of sort of fear and inability to really express their mind in those countries.
Ran, what do you think about that? Nadim says this doesn't play into the peace process in the region, but do you think that this is Morocco sort of positioning itself, attempting to be a mediator between the Israeli and Palestinian officials?
No, I disagree. I think that the people who are actually scared to voice their opinions are the Arabs under Hamas or under the PA. And I think this is a perfect example of the different approaches. When people want to have peace and good economic ties and prosperity, then Israel is reaching out its hand, and you can have a peace deal with Israel and any other Arab country. If the whole point is just to vilify Israel and to hurt Israel and harm Israel, then that's not gonna happen. And honestly, I couldn't care less right now about the situation with the Arabs of Gaza and Judea and Samaria when it comes to Israel's peace deals with other countries, because it should not be with any connection. By the way, if anything, the Arabs of Judea and Samaria and Gaza are making a profit from this, because when you have a better economy, the people who also gain from it are the Arabs who live in our area. So if anything, it's helping them. The only thing it's not helping is the vilifying campaign against Israel that is conducted by many NGOs, such as Human Rights Watch, that doesn't really care about the prosperity, not of the Israelis or of the Arabs living in this area.
I'm going to throw it right back to you, Nadim. What do you think about that interpretation?
Well, it was interesting that your guest doesn't seem to be able to use the word Palestinians or the West Bank or Gaza. I think it shows the ideological leaning. That he doesn't care, I can understand that. Maybe it's good for Israel to have normalization deals. But is it necessarily better for peace? Let's talk about peace. How is that making life better for people in Gaza or in the West Bank? Morocco was already in a state of peace with Israel for many years, a cold peace. So this is not really going to change much on the ground. In terms of what people care about, it was very interesting to see the reaction during the latest aggression first in Jerusalem and then in Gaza. 48 cities in Morocco saw protests. Does that show that Moroccans are embracing the new deal with Israel with great warmth? I don't think so. Now, in these countries, sure, these deals will go forward. Elites will benefit. There will be a trade, and we saw it with Pegasus and other transfers of technology, capital for spying technology. There might be some other benefits. Yasmina described them very well from Morocco, from the US side, or from the Israeli side in terms of trade. I'm not denying any of this, but I'm just not convinced that this is going to lead to any positive spillover for the region, particularly if you think about, stopping the settlement enterprise in Israel. That hasn't reined it in at all. Or actually, creating broader feelings of solidarity or support in the region. What sort of trade are we seeing? Again, I go back to the example of, spyware and cybersecurity or drones, this is all collaboration for more control of populations in the region.
Yasmina, Nadim pointed out some of those protests that happened recently in Morocco. What's the general feeling on the ground in Morocco to the normalisation with relations?
Well, the population is very much against normalization in the majority. Even before Morocco's own deal, the people protested against normalization with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. You can see this in the Arab Barometer, as Nadim said, or the Arab Index opinion data. Right after the December 2020 deal, there were protests across the board. They were banned. And then in March, again, protests broke out despite the ban. And finally, after the Israeli violence in Jerusalem and Gaza, there were protests across 46 countries, across the board, thousands in Marrakesh, much more in Casablanca, and even the capital, Rabat. There have also been social media campaigns since December 2020 that clearly show that Moroccans are against normalization. And most recently, people took to the streets and asked for the deal to be canceled. So I think it's very clear, not only on the population level, but also, when we say elites, who are we talking about? Are you talking about the regime, which is obviously in favor of the deal, or other political figures, who most of which came out against the deal? Most notably, in today's visit, Prime Minister Saadettin Otmani refused to meet with the Israeli foreign minister. Before that, the PJD, the country currently, the party currently leading government, came out against the deal altogether. So I think, across the board and on many levels, people are still against normalization. Not much has changed. I would also add that as per the benefits and what this will change for Israel, I very much doubt that this visit today or the normalization deal or US recognition of Western Sahara will sway Moroccan public opinion. These citizens have been invested in the Palestinian cause for a long time. They've made that very clear. What will a visit do? Probably not much in terms of the population.
Ran, what do you say to that? Can a country normalise its relationship with Israel but still support the Palestinian cause, or are those two things mutually exclusive?
That's a very tough question, and I'm not sure I have the best answer for you, but I can say it's very different on the Israeli side. The Israeli people are very happy about this peace deal. First of all, you have a very big segment of the Israeli population that has some of its heritage embedded in Morocco, so they're very excited to basically go to where they were from before they were exiled from Morocco. And also, Israelis who have no connection to Morocco are very happy. We have nothing against the Moroccan people, would be very happy to come and visit and have a strong ties with them. And I think that basically that's the whole story of Israel in the Middle East. We reach out our hands for peace, and the Arab countries for a long time have refused. And our main concern is actually the thing that people call the cause of the Arabs of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, but they're not really caring about the Arabs who live there. They just want Israel to be annihilated. And the best example would be SodaStream, the factory that because of international pressure had to be shut down. The people who lost from it were the Arabs from Ramallah, not the Jews from Tel Aviv. But I think that's the case. People are saying that they're willing to lose both of their eyes as long as they can, hurt one eye of the Israelis. The question is, will the people in Morocco or anywhere else in the Middle East will become a big fan of Israel? I don't know, but I think that Israelis visiting Morocco and Moroccans visiting Israel would be a good step. Again, Israel is reaching out its hand for peace for everyone, apart from those who are saying that they want to annihilate Israel, even if they present it as if they call it peace and non-violent organizations like BDS and so on and so forth, that again could not care less about the prosperity of the Arabs of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. They just want to hurt Israel.
Nadim, what would you assume the Palestinian community is feeling about today's visit in Morocco? We saw that there were protests on the streets by the members of the public, but do they feel abandoned?
Definitely. The Palestinians feel abandoned by Arab regimes and Arab states for a long time. Could probably argue that the Palestinians also feel abandoned by their corrupt leadership. Yes, it's clear that these deals have hurt, to a certain extent, the diplomatic support for the Palestinians that they used to have in Arab countries. One could argue that that diplomatic support has been very weak for the last 10, 15 years. This is definitely another nail in its coffin, not just with Morocco, but particularly with UAE, Bahrain, and even some of the what was happening with sort of Saudi and in terms of toning down their criticism and toning down their support for the Palestinians. But what's interesting, and I think your guest was referring to that, we're seeing new forms of solidarity with Palestinians. A new form of solidarity that is not based on being Arab, but actually being based on human rights, being based on standing with those whose rights have been violated, and expressions exactly like the BDS movement, which is making
being
Israelis
anti-Semitic.
very nervous. You know, I think this is encouraging, and what we're seeing today amongst a younger generation of Arabs across the region are new forms of solidarity with Palestinians. Their solidarity with Palestinians is different than their parents' generation solidarity. It's based on basic sense of fairness, and of course, a sense that you know, a big injustice has been committed. And this is not about annihilating Israel or anything like that. Demanding basic rights, demanding respect for international law. When we start seeing people playing with language to change this, to say this is about aggression, it's just changing the terms of the discussion. And it's going to be interesting with the Biden administration. We don't expect any major change in U.S. policy, but what is clear is the sort of Trumpian approach that used to exist before in U.S. foreign policy is changing, and we're starting to see at least a branch of the Democratic Party in the U.S. that is adopting another discourse. So let's hope that this new form of solidarity, be it in the West, be it in the region, can somehow push for real peace, because it's definitely not through these normalization deals that we're going to see peace in the region.
Yasmina, when we speak about the region, have the countries that signed on to these deals now almost created a wedge with countries that haven't? Is this dividing the region rather than bringing them together?
Thank you, Melinda. I'll answer that, but right before I'm going to introduce a correction. Jewish Moroccans were not exiled from Morocco. This is factually incorrect. Some of them decided to go to Israel, and the Jewish Israeli lobby came over and arranged that, and others emigrated to Canada and Europe and the United States. I think that's a very important correction. To answer your question, there is a division right now symbolically. There are countries that have normalized and others that have not. If we're looking at Morocco specifically, Morocco has not changed its position on Palestine. The regime has been insistent on that. What it's saying it's doing is that it's developing new ties with Israel, and that this is separate from its position on Palestine. And so there have been no Arab countries that came out and said, we're against Palestine, we do not support the same position we did before. So in that sense, there is no wedge other than a symbolic one. But I think what's important here is that Morocco is focusing on economic development, economic ties, but that its position and its aid to the Palestinians have not changed. As a matter of fact, through the Al-Quds Committee, it has increased aid recently. So I think we shouldn't confuse the two.
Ran, I want to ask you, some Arab pundits have said that these normalisation deals gave Israel the confidence that it needed to perhaps undertake some of these attacks that we saw, these deadly attacks in May. What would you say to that?
I would say that when I'm speaking with you and your guests, I feel like we're looking at the world very, very differently. I think that you guys are looking at the world upside down. There's normalization in the Middle East. Countries are having peace deals, and people are complaining about it and saying it might hurt the stability. By the way, I completely disagree. There were Jews who were ethnically cleansed from Arab and Muslim countries. When the Moroccan Jews left Morocco and came to Israel, they came with nothing because all of their property was left in Morocco.
That is factually
continue. I just want to say, all right. And just one more thing, we have to remember, I keep saying, you know, you're referring to the Arabs of Judea and Samaria and Gaza as if there was an entity, a state that was called Palestine. So let's just make one thing clear. There was never a state called Palestine, which is why this whole case is just to vilify Israel and hurt Israel. It's not to help the Arabs. So when you're saying, will Israel retaliate? Oh, hold on. If you're nodding as if I'm saying something that's actually wrong. When was this country called Palestine created? Who was their prime minister? What currency did they use?
Well, look, before we get into that, before we delve into that rabbit hole, let's bring it back to these normalisation deals. I want to ask you, because we're running out of time, Nadim, I want to ask you, do you expect to see more Arab countries in the region sign these deals when we see that there are perhaps economic security benefits on the cards?
Look, I think with the Trump administration gone, I think that process is on hold for now. We don't see any country that is immediately jumping at this. Will that resume in the future? No one knows. But I think the process is going to slow down a bit at this stage. There isn't much of a momentum as far as I can tell. As to whether Palestine is a state and so forth, your guest should check the ICC recognition of Palestine as a state. But again,
When
this
was
is a
it created?
distraction.
When
This
was
is
it
a
created?
distraction. It wasn't created because Israel occupied where it was supposed to be. Look at the UN resolutions. But again, this is a distraction. We're just, you're changing the
Answer the
terms of
question
the
because
debate.
there's no answer. It was never created.
Well,
There was never a state called Palestine.
isn't this discussion that we're having now just the prime example of perhaps why we need formal diplomatic relations between these two regions, because views are so polarized? Yasmina, what do you think? Shouldn't these sorts of discussions finally be had between the two parties that it involves, as opposed to perhaps, you know, just seeing protests on the streets?
I think that there was never an issue of discussion or being able to talk, or, you know, for example, Morocco facilitated in the 60s, 70s, and 80s talks between various parties. I don't think this is the issue. I don't think this is what our current conversation or debate is pointing to. I think that, you know, when there is clear, when Moroccan citizens, when people from the Arab region are seeing violence, aggressive violence against any people, Arabs or not, it puts them off of normalization. Perhaps if the behavior changed on the other side, people would be more accepting. But when there's bombing and there's major loss of life and children are dying and suffering, people on the ground are going to remain against normalization. So there needs to be some effort and some change. That's what I think.
Ran, what do you think? Do you think that there will be a push for more normalization efforts with other countries in the region?
Oh, I sure hope so, but don't you find it interesting? Again, the topic is supposed to be Israel and Morocco, and everything that people are here talking about is Israel doing something wrong to the Arabs of Judea and Samaria and Gaza, without any mention of the Hamas's wrongdoing. Hamas is killing children in Gaza. Hamas is firing rockets at innocent civilians in Israel. But apparently the Moroccans who care so much about human rights, they don't care about that. This is the problem with the discourse. Yes, I do hope that we'll have many more peace deals. Israel is reaching out its hands for peace. I'm reaching out my hands for peace. For anyone who's not trying to annihilate me, and you can, sugarcoat it with many beautiful names like human rights and peace and whatever, but what you're saying basically at the end of the day, Israel should not exist, or it's okay that Hamas are firing rockets at Israel, then I would not have peace with that specifically. The rest of the world, yes. And more peace deals between Israel and more Arab and Muslim countries, I think it's beneficial for both sides, economically, culturally, from tourism, for prosperity and stability of the Middle East. Yes, I do hope for that. And I do hope that when this will happen, people will say, why are we supporting this fake nation of Arabs in Judea and Samaria and Gaza that have never existed? Why are we supporting them? They're not promoting anything in the world apart from different ways to commit terror attacks.
Nadim, I do see you having a little smirk there, but I do want to ask you though, do you believe that diplomatic efforts, these normalization efforts, can eventually make a difference, or every day the opinions of the people on the ground are not going to change and it's not going to be helpful? Is this purely political and economic, and people on the ground, life goes on as normal?
It's transactional, yes. Look, there's been an Arab peace initiative at the table since 2002 that the Israelis rejected because they don't want to stop their expansion settlements. So let's not talk about peace. Yes, these are transactional deals. Yes, some Israelis are going to benefit. Yes, some people close to the regime in Morocco and some elites in the UAE and others are going to benefit. But nothing your guest has said and nothing I have read convinces me that somehow this is going to have a spillover effect. If you really want to have, we know what needs to happen. We know what needs to happen, and we've known this for decades. And it's not about annihilating Israel. The Arab Peace Initiative from the Arab League, not my favorite institution, but from the Arab League, is very clear. They offer full normalization of relations if Israel withdraws from the occupied territories, the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, what they still occupy in Lebanon, and find a fair solution to the Palestinian refugees. It's been on the table for 20 years. The Israelis don't care about it. So no, this is not about peace. This is not about fairness. This is transactional. I'm happy, for your guest if he feels he can travel more easily now to a number of Arab countries. I hope he learns something from it, including the existence of the Palestinian people and the state of Palestine. Maybe that will help him see the world slightly differently. But until then, no, these deals are not part of a very positive dynamic in the region. Again, what is Israel selling to the region? Surveillance, drones. So if it's this mixing of Arab capital and Israeli technology, sorry, this is not my vision of the region I would like to live in.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Always a spirited debate when we touch on this topic, and I really do appreciate all of your time and your expertise and your passion as we discuss the normalisation of relations between Israel and Morocco. Ran, Yasmina and Nadim, thank you for joining us on The Newsmakers. And thank you at home for watching. We'll see you next time on The Newsmakers.